For the third reading today, I've chosen a passage from Luke's Gospel, which is an account of the very first meeting between Jesus and John the Baptist before either of them was born. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. In a loud voice, she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the child you will bear. But why am I so favored that the mother of my Lord should come to me? As soon as the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby in my womb leaped for joy." These are words inspired by God. I've personally known two people who lived to be over 100. Ireland's father was born in March of 1917 and died in October 2017. And the other person I knew very well was John Keeler, who was known as the Rebel Keeler because of his role in the Irish freedom movement from 1916 to 1922. So here's John's story. John's parents lived in a little village called Turini, which is about 6 miles from Galway City in the west of Ireland. And every Saturday, his mother would walk with a basket of eggs from Turini into Galway to sell the eggs. Walk in 6 miles, sell the eggs, and then walk back 6 miles as well. But on August the 15th, 1899, when she was 6 months pregnant, she went into labor in the middle of the market. And she delivered her baby. She put him in the basket, recently vacated by the eggs, and walked home 6 miles. But the little baby was so small, he was 3 months premature, obviously. He couldn't take the nipple, he couldn't suckle on the nipple. So she had to feed him through a turkey quill. His mouth was so small. And on August the 15th, 1999, at their home in Turini, I celebrated Mass for him and his family on his 100th birthday. And he lived for another year. He lived to be 101. So, by way of introduction, I've been taken as a theme for this month, the question of abortion. And for the last 2 Sundays, I've covered many, many aspects of this issue. And so today being the third Sunday, I'm going to do a recap and then open it up to a Q&A. So the first place I started off was, I wanted to look at the idea of a debate or discussion or dialogue, no matter what the topic is. And what I've seen as a psychologist over the years is that, there are 2 poles to every kind of dialogue or debate or discussion. And the first pole is that if there are intelligent, moral, spiritual people on opposite sides of any debate, then there must be some merit to both positions. And so we find out that the wise one learns from the fool, but the fool never learns from the wise one. So being open to the realization that if there are spiritual, intelligent, moral people on both sides of any question, then there must be some merit to both sides. That's the first pole of any kind of dialogue. There's a second pole as well. And the second pole is that not all viewpoints are equally valid. And so, for instance, the position of the Ku Klux Klan and the position of Martin Luther King Jr. On African Americans, they do not have equal value. In fact, it's what philosophy will call a performative contradiction and a logical fallacy to hold that all positions are equally valid. That statement itself is elevating itself to being the best articulation of the situation, and therefore it contradicts itself. So not all viewpoints are equally valid. So we have to hold this balance, this dance. All moral choices then dance between these 2 poles, that if there are intelligent, moral people on both sides, then it's important that we listen to each other. But secondly, that not all positions are equally valid on every issue. So that's the first thing I established. No matter what the dialogue or the debate, whatever the subject matter is, that is true. I went on to talk then about life itself. Because unless I understand what life is, then I cannot grasp what human life is or what personhood means. And therefore, if I don't understand what life means, then the abortion debate is mired in just emotional dueling. So we have to understand, firstly, what is life? What do we mean by life? Or when does life begin? The current Roman Catholic position is that life begins at conception. There's another theory that life only begins with the quickening, when the mother for the first time feels the movement of the baby in her womb. The third position is that life begins when we can first detect a heartbeat in the embryo. And that happens at about 6 weeks. We can literally detect a heartbeat in the embryo at 6 weeks. Another position is that life only begins when the fetus is viable. Now, the viability of the fetus is being pushed way back because of modern medicine. And as my friend John Keeler illustrates, he was 3 months pregnant. He arrived so small that he couldn't even take the nipple. So he was not, in no sense was he viable. So does that mean that he wasn't a human being? And another position then is that the first breath, life only begins with the first breath. So is Roman Catholicism true that it begins at conception, or does it begin at the quickening, or does it begin with the heartbeat, or does it only begin when the fetus is viable, or does it begin with the first breath? These are all the different theories about life. Now, I think we have to look at, and to understand life, we have to look at the notion of intelligence. So I always remember many years ago, near my office in Los Altos, there was a restaurant that I would go for lunch there. And I remember one day I was drinking a bowl of soup, and I put my spoon in and I fished out a piece of broccoli. And I fell into a kind of a reverie. And I began to realize that even a piece of broccoli has three different kinds of intelligence. The first one I would call creative intelligence, that at some stage broccoli did not exist on the planet. So at some stage there was a kind of a morphogenetic field set up, or a proto-template created, the first piece of broccoli, and then it took off from there. So I would call that creative intelligence. Secondly, this little piece of broccoli that was sitting in my spoon had what I would call a sustaining intelligence. So this little piece that was planted in the ground, was engaging with, it was dancing with photosynthesis. It was dancing with the minerals in the ground. It was dancing with the water from rain, and it was sustaining itself by the dance it's performing with all of these elements. And then the third piece I could see, the third form of intelligence, I would call it regifting intelligence. So this little piece of broccoli, as soon as I ate it, now became part of me. So in some senses, its intelligence is being subsumed to a human level of intelligence. Or even if it was cast aside and just left to die on the ground, it would regift itself back into the ecosystem. So there's this kind of regifting intelligence that happens even with a piece of broccoli. So when I think about life, I think about those considerations. I then moved on to talk about, is there a distinction between life per se and human life? What is the distinction? So a rose is alive, an elephant is alive, a chimpanzee are alive, but we don't ever mix these up with human beings. We know the difference between a rose and a human, or between an elephant and a human, or even between a chimp and a human. Although with chimps, we share about 98.4% of our DNA with them. So what makes us specifically human? So at what stage then does the developing embryo become a human being? Is it a human being at the moment of the zygote, when the sperm and the egg meet each other in the womb? Does it begin with the evolution of the embryo? Or does it begin only at the stage when it becomes a fetus? So what makes it a human life? Now, the answer to this question, I don't think science can answer, or the legal system can't answer. For me, it's both a spiritual and a mystical question. So we need to kind of deal with that at a much deeper level than just the kind of the legality of the system, or even the kind of the science of the system. So with that question in mind then, when does abortion involve the taking of a human life? So for instance, a 2-day-old zygote versus an 8-month-old fetus, is there a difference there when we kind of consider this question of terminating a pregnancy? So there's a huge difference obviously then between a morning after pill that simply vacates a zygote whose size is less than the period at the end of a sentence, on the one hand, and aborting an 8-month-old fetus who literally is pulled piece by piece from the womb. Hugely different. And if it's a question of viability, even a 2-year-old child is totally incapable of sourcing its own food, its own shelter, its own clothing, its own emotional support. So why not allow the mother to murder a 2-year-old child, or a jealous sibling to kill his 2-year-old sibling. So that my consideration of a human life. But there's a third stage beyond life, human life. There's the stage of personhood. Once we define a human life, there's a huge difference then between being a human and being a person. So we go a transition from life to human life to personhood. The question is, who decides who is a person? What kind of a decision is this? Is this a legal decision to assign personhood to a human life? And so is it the lawmakers that decide? Or is it a biological issue and therefore the medical people get to decide? Or is it a theological issue and therefore religious people get to decide? Or is it a private issue and only the mother can decide when a human life becomes a person? Then I traced for you the kind of the movement and the evolution of the notion of personhood. At the very, very beginning of our journey, going back tens of thousands of years, the only persons were male rulers. Nobody else was regarded as having personhood. There were vassals of various kinds, or there were resources of various kinds, or there were property of various kinds for the male rulers. Only male rulers were accorded personhood. Then at some stage we evolved and we afforded personhood to all adult freeborn males. But you had to be freeborn and you had to be an adult and you had to be a male in order to be accorded personhood. That was the second movement of personhood. In 1865, with our tremendous genius here, we gave personhood to US corporations. And in the Constitution of the United States of America right now, corporations are regarded as persons with all the rights of person. So they can get involved, for instance, in kind of political campaigns as corporations. So that was the next stage of it. Very, very recently, we accorded personhood to adult females. Then latterly, we gave personhood to children. And then finally, we gave personhood to slaves. So at what stage then do we become persons? In South Africa in the 1840s, many of the great big game hunters, they needed permits from the government in order to go out to kill, wildlife. And there's various categories of wildlife. And there's a report from the 1840s in South Africa listed under mammals. The big game hunters had shot and killed 400 Bushman females, because the Bushman was not regarded at that stage as having personhood. And so the records show that 400 female Bushmen were killed, in South Africa in the 1840s. In Tasmania, when the British, invaded Tasmania, they regarded the native people, the Maori, as just animals. They didn't deserve personhood. So they pretty much exterminated all of them. And they took the last male and the last female, sent it to a taxidermist, stuffed it, and sent it back to the British Museum. And only in the last 20 years were these two stuffed male and female Maoris returned to Tasmania. So they weren't regarded as persons. So before then, females were accorded personhood, and before children were accorded personhood, and before slaves were accorded personhood. Were they not people then? Even if they weren't illegally regarded as having personhood, were they people or were they not people? Were they humans or were they not humans? And what happens when we rescind personhood? And this has happened many, many times and even in recent human history. And very typically, the rescinding of personhood goes through 4 stages that I can see. The first stage is you take one population and you dehumanize it. You regard them as not being human anymore. Then you vilify them for some perceived problem they create. Then you ostracize them, and finally, you exterminate them. And we've seen this happen, in this last century many times. Towards the end of World War I, as the empire, the Turkish Empire was being dismantled, 1.5 million Armenians were slaughtered because they weren't regarded as being really persons. In World War II, 6 million Jews were slaughtered because of the perception that they weren't really a human being. They didn't have personhood. And in our own very recent times, in late 1990s, in Rwanda, 800,000 Tutsis were slaughtered in a 3-month period, and they were regarded, the term that was being used by the Hutu was that the Tutsis are cockroaches. And so you withdraw personhood, and then you've got open sesame to do with them as you will. So the question then becomes, it's a very important question, is the fetus only afforded personhood if the mother says so? And otherwise, is it simply a malign growth that can be excised? So who decides on the personhood of the unborn? I then went on to talk about the notion of en-soulment. When does the soul implant in the developing, embryo or fetus? At what stage? According to modern Catholicism, as I said, they regard that the soul is infused literally into the zygote, that at the moment of conception, that God creates a brand new soul and kind of animates the zygote with this brand new soul. Now, Aquinas, way back in the 1200s, believed that actually that only happened after 40 days. 40 days after conception, it became a boy. 80 days after conception, it became a girl. And they determined that by postmortems on pregnant women. So the idea of ensoulment is very different. But whatever it is, in my cosmology, certainly in my cosmology, souls make preconception contracts, to come into planet Earth. They arrange who their parents are going to be, the family is going to be, and they volunteer to come in to incarnate. And so abortion, for whatever reason, means denying incarnation and thwarting a mission. So the soul, is denied the mission it's signed up for. I then looked at the legal issues around it. So killing is taking a life. Murder is taking a life illegally. So there's a legal distinction between mere killing and murder. So killing is just taking a life, but murder is when you do so illegally. So what is a legal killing then? So in the West, we claim that it is legal to kill in war, in self-defense, in capital punishment, and in abortion. And what we find out is that what's legal in one jurisdiction is illegal in other jurisdictions. I talked then as well about who are the parties to the decision that has to be made about the possible kind of a termination of a pregnancy. And I created this kind of simple little formula. I call it AX1 plus BX2 plus CX3 plus DX4. X1 stands for the mother, X2 stands for the father, X3 stands for the child, and X4 stands for society. And A, B, C, and D are the weighting factors. So I assign different weighting factors to each of these four parties, depending on what the costs are to that particular party, if physiologically, psychologically, etc. And so for me, that's the kind of that's like the guiding kind of a formula I use when I think of this question, or when I'm, as a psychologist, advising somebody about this issue. Now, since the unborn cannot represent itself, society then has two kinds of responsibility. It has a responsibility to society and has a responsibility to the unborn. And it exercises this very frequently. So, for instance, society reserves to itself the right to override the parents if a 5-year-old child is being abused at home. So society has a duty to society per se, and also to the child. I then went on and looked at the moral dimension of making such a choice. And for me, morality is to ethics as engineering is to pure mathematics. In other words, morality is applied ethics, just as engineering is applied mathematics. So another way I'd put it is that ethics is the science of living, and morality is the art of living. And I've come to the conclusion over the years that there are no such thing as absolute moral laws. There is no such thing as absolute moral laws. Sometimes it is even good to steal or to tell lies. So although there are no absolute moral laws, I believe that there are absolute moral values. And among those are respect for life, respect for truth, respect for property, respect for sexuality, and respect for other people's reputations. So we're guided then by absolute moral values, even if there are differing moral kind of principles enacted. And I like to distinguish as well between what I think of as the yin and the yang of moral reasoning. So the yang of moral reasoning is simply the application of willpower to a revealed or legislated edict. So either in the scriptural traditions of which you're a part or the legislature that enacts particular decrees, Yang says you simply apply willpower to the edict or to the revelation. And that's how you make moral decisions. The yin says it differently. The yin looks at where do the ripples, you know, end, and what is, it's a kind of a context dependent thinking. So you're looking at the wider implications of the choices you're making. It's not just simply the kind of application of willpower to an edict, but looking at what are the long-term effects and what are the ripples and who's connected and what context is involved in it. Now, personally, I think that moral reasoning needs to employ all three, to look at the ripple effect, to look at the principles, and to look at the willpower involved. A well-known cardinal of Chicago many years ago, Cardinal Bernardine, talked about what he called the seamless garment approach, where he said that any discussion of the sanctity of life must be evenly applied to the death penalty, to self-defense, to warfare, and to abortion. We can't have one set of rules when we take life in one context and a different set of rules when we take life in another context. So this, he called it the seamless garment approach, that any discussion of the sanctity of life must be evenly applied to all of these areas. So I think then about stuff like the moral abuse of this. So for instance, racially motivated abortion, or you find out in a scan that you're going to have a blue-eyed baby and you decide you don't want a blue-eyed baby, so you abort it because you wanted, a brown-eyed baby or whatever. Or you think that a scan shows that the fetus is compromised or, deformed in some senses, and we only want physically perfect bodies. Now, the question is, do physically perfect bodies grow up to moral, human beings? Not necessarily. There have been many human beings born into physically perfect bodies who've grown up to be criminals, tyrants, and mass murderers. And there are many kind of deformed human beings who've been born into us and who for us are they're the incarnation of pure love, like children who are born with Down syndrome, and they're extraordinarily partial for being loving creatures. So the physical condition of the embryo on its own is not enough reason to decide to terminate it immediately. Now, what are some of the exceptions? I've counseled many, many women over the years on this issue. For me, when I look at if the mother's health is going to be seriously affected, either physically or psychologically by the pregnancy, I think there's room for the termination of a pregnancy. I think if there are very significant familial or financial repercussions, there are grounds for terminating a pregnancy. In the case of rape and incest, which is then compounded by the insult of having to bear and raise the perpetrator's baby, I would say, yes, these are grounds for terminating a pregnancy. But I would add that in every single case, termination needs to happen as early as possible within the first trimester. And that, it's the basis of a conscience, which is a well-informed conscience. So, that's the other side of the argument for me. I look then at the entire spectrum of kind of the thinking about terminating a human life. So does society have a right to say to women, as it did for the longest period of time, you have a womb, bear children? Does society have the right, as it said to men throughout the ages, you're a man, bear arms? So that the woman has to give life and the men have to give their lives for the group. When I see this kind of one-liner slogans, anytime I see a complex human phenomenon or an important human decision being reduced to a one-liner slogan, I have big problems with that. So when I hear the statement, take your hands off my body, to whom is this being actually addressed? Because the pro-lifers are not putting their hands on the woman's body. Who's actually putting their hands on the woman's body? The abortion doctor is the person putting the hands, on the body. So when you say, take your hands off my body, to whom are you referring? And is it the mother that has this right to say, take your hands off my body? Or does the child, the unborn child, not have the right to say, take your hands off my body? And do we have the same notion, for instance, around, modern medical mandates? Do I not have the right to say, take your hands off my body? So, if I'm faced with losing my job or being kind of refused entry into various places unless I take a mandated medical procedure, can I not say, take your hands off my body? So that for me is another consideration. So there's this seesaw effect then that happens with rights and responsibilities. So if a woman decides, for instance, to carry a child, the father then, whether he's in favor of having a baby or not, is mandated to support it to age 18. So the father has no right to insist on an abortion, and if he wants the child, he has no right to veto an abortion. So there's a discrepancy there between the kind of the rights and the responsibilities. And throughout human society, I've seen this, I call it a society-specific seesaw. In some instances, there are no rights, but lots of obligations. And in other situations, there are no obligations, but full rights. There's a balance to be achieved somewhere in between. I looked at the question of a teenage pregnancy. A 13-year-old girl becomes pregnant with her boyfriend and decides to have an abortion. Do the parents have no right for input or to advise the child? And so there's this extraordinary spectrum that I see around the question of abortion. On one end, there are societies which say no abortion ever under any circumstances. That's one end of it. A little bit further on, there is restricted choice for abortion based on the stage of the pregnancy and the cause of the pregnancy. Then at another end, there's abortion for any reason you want, up to and including birth. You can kill the child at any stage, even including the birthing of the child. And then the final position is mandated abortion, such as they have in China, where you're allowed only one child and every subsequent pregnancy has to be aborted. I talked then last week about, I think it's very important. If you're squeamish, you need to close your ears at this stage for a little bit. But it's very important to understand medically what actually happens during a late-term abortion. And a late-term abortion is from 24 weeks onwards, from the end of the second trimester. I watched a video by a woman gynecologist who had performed over 1,200 abortions before she changed her mind about what she was doing. And she spoke in graphic detail about what the process is. And the process is the following. There are no pain meds given to the unborn. And the unborn child at this stage, after 24 weeks, can feel pain. But there are no meds given to the unborn child. Then the gynecologist will dilate the cervix and insert the forceps with really, really sharp teeth at the end. And the abortionist is working blind. There's no imaging possible. She's searching around inside for something to grab onto. And then she finds something, she grabs, the teeth bite into it, and then she has to pull really hard to bring it out. But it doesn't come out as a unit. It comes out a piece at a time. So at one stage, you're going to pull something out, and you see it's a leg, and you put it on the table. And then you go back in again, you search around, you pull out, and you bring out an arm. And then you go in and you pull out the spinal cord. And now this is really freaky. You go in at some stage, and you know that you've grabbed the head, according to this. When you crush it, a white liquid leaks out from the system. And you realize then you've just crushed the brain of the child. And then you count all the body parts. You put all the body parts on the table. You line them up like you're recreating a doll that a child dismembered. And you're recreating it because you have to be sure that you got out all of the parts in order to prevent an infection of the mother or a bleed out for the mother. So that's actually what happens in a late-term abortion. It's important for us to realize that that's the experience that the child is having. And so over the last 3 weeks, then including today, I've looked at the 4 parties to the decision: the mother, the child, the father, and society. And I've looked at the various factors for all parties involved. I looked at the legal aspects, the medical, the physiological, the emotional, the mental, the sociological, and the spiritual. So I've given what I consider a very thorough pro and con multimodality survey of a very complex issue. And because I would be really remiss as a spiritual director of a spiritual community if I didn't address this complex and hugely important topic, this is why I've chosen to deal with it. So we owe it to ourselves and to society to be fully informed of all aspects of the issue and not simply be triggered emotionally by one particular perspective. It becomes really important that we realize that even the Catholic Church teaches that conscience is the ultimate arbiter of moral decisions, but it must be a fully informed conscience, and that takes a lot of work. So to end up with, whether we're talking about war or abortion, experiment Homo Sapiens Sapiens needs to evolve beyond the primitive position that taking a human life is a good way to solve a human problem. 3 nights ago, I had a dream. And in the dream, a voice told me, write this down. I got up, went out to my office, and wrote it down. And here's what the voice dictated to me. It said this. It said, here is a brief history of the world. First, God created adults. He didn't create children, he created Adam and Eve. First, God created adults. Then adults created children. Then children created laughter. And finally, God rested. Mission accomplished. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.
The perspective on all of this from God has been muddied, I think, by the way the Bible is written and our anthropomorphizing of God in the Old Testament, because he seems to be able to kill and murder whoever he chooses, yet Christ never even slapped a person. And so this appears to be what we're talking about as far as life and death is concerned, an entirely human decision, because my perception of God and my own cosmology is that he's a permanently emanating source of love and energy, and doesn't say, Sean's a bad person, he's committed a lot of sins, I'm going to kill him. So could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure, Tom. So, as you know, I've written an entire book about that. That the
Mm-hmm.
God, the name of the book was Setting God Free, Moving Beyond the Character We've Created in Our Own Image. So every kind of religious system, although it begins with some kind of a mystical impulse, inevitably devolves into some kind of hierarchical system, that insists on some kind of orthodoxy. So God never decrees the killing of a human being. So, in some senses, God has no will for anything except that we finally realize our own inner divinity, the inner divinity of all other life forms, and the expression of love and compassion for all different life forms. So, God doesn't judge anybody. The question then becomes, if we discover our inner divinity, and we discover the inner divinity of everybody else, how do we kind of live in human lives? How do we live even in a food pyramid? And I don't actually believe in a food pyramid. I believe rather in a food circle. It's not like that human beings as carnivores are at the top of the pile and that we eat animals who eat plants, who eat sunlight. I don't believe in that. I believe it's a circle because we're host to kind of to bacteria. 80% of the human biome, gut biome, is bacteria. We're basically meals on wheels for these bacteria. And so there's a cycle rather than a pyramid. But in order to survive in some way, we have to abide by some kinds of rules of engagement. So the question is, what moral models, allow for the most peace, the most love, and the most compassion? And so we, as I say, then we have these absolute moral values like respect for life and for truth and for kind of people's reputation and for nature. But how do we express those in moral principles depending on the physical situations in which we find ourselves? So I give you an example, for instance, of being in a mission in Kipsaraman in Kenya, hiding refugees when during ethnic cleansing. And people coming by from a different tribe and saying, are you hiding such and such? And I'm saying, no. And I'm lying through my teeth. Because for me, the moral thing to do was to tell a lie. So we have to try to balance these absolute moral kind of values with moral principles, which are not absolute. So it's the application of these then. So as human societies, we have to figure out for ourselves what is the most loving thing to do for everybody involved in the decisions we make. What is the ripple effect, not just my immediate family, but in generations yet to become? And since I believe very strongly that we make what I call a preconception contract with each other before we come in, and we decide who's going to be parents, who are going to be siblings, who are going to be neighbors, in the situation into which we come, then one of the considerations is what happens when a soul who's volunteered for incarnation, that their mission is terminated artificially and prematurely by a decision to abort them. The same thing would be true, obviously, killing in warfare, or killing with self-defense, or killing in kind of execution. That every time we terminate or kind of truncate a human life, in some senses, we're interfering with the mission of that particular soul. So it becomes very important then that I keep saying that the most important considerations are not the legal ones, not the medical ones, not the kind of physical ones, not even the emotional ones or the sociological ones, but the spiritual value that we kind of put onto human beings, live human beings. And therefore, our decision making needs to, in some senses, prioritize that consideration over all the others. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Sean, for expanding my thinking on this very difficult subject. And I have mentioned to several people that you were giving a series of homilies on this, and pretty much all of them asked me, why now?
Why now? My answer to that is very simple. Why not now? It's a hugely important, complex question. I'm the spiritual director for a community. I deal with a lot of esoteric kinds of stuff. This is an issue that is really important, so I'm dealing with it right now.
I thought maybe it was due to the legislation that's coming. That's
I've,
coming.
I've, I've zero interest in getting involved in the politics of the legislation around this. I'm
Okay.
interested in it as a human being and as a spiritual being.
According to the organization CARE, there are 25,000 children that starve to death every day. You know, there's a whole lot of emotion and resources put into the abortion issue here. I think that pales in comparison with the 25,000 children that could be saved and that are fully developed human beings. Just a bit of perspective, 25,000 children, that's 8 9/11s every single day. And we allow that to happen. The suffering of these children, it doesn't take any imagination to figure out that it far exceeds any suffering that a fetus would go through.
The fact that children are suffering through the abortion process and the fact that children are being starved to death, they're not separate issues. It's not that I'm going to focus on one and ignore the other. Any place there's human suffering, whether it's among children or adults, we need to take cognizance and to deal with it. So one focus on one doesn't excuse a focus on another. Any place there is suffering, we need to deal with it as human beings. And any place where we're using the killing of human beings as a solution to human problems is a bad solution, and we need to grow beyond that.